Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. A very warm welcome to this TMForum and Tory Harris webinar, Microservices Government's Best Practice for CSPs. I can see from the large number of you that are online to listen to us, this probably has piqued your interest. I think if we looked at the telecoms industry the last 2, 3, 4 years, we see more and more operators starting to talk about the use of microservices. I think that goes in hand with operators more broadly wanting to control and manage their technology roadmaps. And we're seeing this in different parts of the telco business. It might be in the network part of the business, it might be in the IT function. We see microservices discussed in the context of virtual network functions, and I think a number of you who are working in that area are following with great interest the evolution of the network towards cloud native, and the inevitable deployment of microservices. We're at the fairly early stages of that, I would say, but nevertheless, some of the larger operators, I think, the Telefonicas and AT&Ts are already talking about deploying microservices. Then when we think more about the customer-facing parts of the business, the customer experience, where the customers experience services, and I think we see a reasonable amount of activity here with operators, particularly rolling out new digital channels. And I think for those digital channels, many operators are using microservice deployments, partnering with current and new vendors in that regard. And the last example we've given here is operators sort of co-creating with their customers around microservices. So they're just a few examples, and I think what's interesting is that with this microservice deployment taking place in different parts of the telco business. So I think when we consider, and that's an interesting discussion for us to have, I think, around governance across the whole technology estate rather than around parts of the business. So I think when you start to think through exactly where we are seeing this microservices deployment taking place, we can think on the one hand about the network, and on the other hand around IT and operations. So certainly, within the 5G core, we're seeing this activity. We're also seeing a lot of operators now talking about deploying open RAN-based solutions, and I think some of them are looking at microservices in order to embrace some of the open RAN concepts as well. I think when we think about the IT part of the business, I think where we're seeing activity is in front-end systems. The stateless nature of those front-end systems makes them well suited towards microservices. I think maybe it's more difficult to see some of the legacy systems that sit behind the front-end systems. This is looking at one example, and this is Vodafone, and a big thanks to Ben Connolly of Vodafone UK, who produced this little image. So Vodafone's digital transformation is particularly interesting in the context of microservices. So when you look at Vodafone's IT estate today, they are accepting that when it comes to the legacy back-end systems, that it's going to take some time to start to modernize and change the approach towards those back-end systems. So given that we have those back-end systems, which are very tightly integrated systems, and yet operators and Vodafone wants to innovate at the front end, Vodafone has built what it calls a digital experience layer. It calls it DXL for shorthand. And I think when we look more broadly at Vodafone stated that it wants to move towards more digital experience, more digital touch points rather than physical touch points. And so it needs to have this layer to enable this decoupling of the front end, these digital bit chatbots, voice assistants, websites, and linking into the back-end systems. So Vodafone has been working with a number of technology partners. It also does some of its own in-sourcing, and it's built this digital experience layer based on microservices. And this is something that Vodafone is rolling out over a period of time across all of its networks in all parts of the world. It's not happening simultaneously. I think the UK has launched. I think some of the European markets may have launched, but it's certainly not true in every marketplace today. I think what is interesting is that when we think again about those back-end systems, as I mentioned before, when it comes to microservices deployment, I think they're some way behind. But within TMForum, we do see initiatives around what we call the open digital architecture, start to look at those back-end systems and start to componentize those back-end systems, which will then lend itself towards the microservices architecture. So we have a second example here from Orange in Poland. And Orange Flex is a new digital-only service which Vodafone launched in, I believe, May 2019. And this service enables you to sign up, to start subscribing entirely digitally. And Orange, I should say, has worked with, I think, 3 principal technology partners, Velocity, Salesforce, and Matrix. And in building this digital service and experience, it's made use of, I believe, 43 microservices. Now, what I think is particularly interesting is that when Orange has talked about the importance of microservices here, it is because even though it has now created this service, it constantly needs to be upgrading and improving different elements of that service when competitive pressures dictate. And so I think, coming back to the benefits of microservices, it's this ability to take different elements of that front-end service and to tweak, improve, change those independently of other parts of the application in order to deliver an improved and differentiated experience. If you want to read more about this case study, then if you visit the inform.tmforum.org website, then there's a very, very nice case study about Orange Poland and the Flex service. So moving on to the question around governance, and I'm sure that the reason why this webinar has piqued your interest is that a number of you are considering approach towards governance at the moment. Just a few comments and thoughts here around microservices and governance. I think based on what we saw from that example from Orange Flex, that these architectures are particularly well suited to parts of the business where there's the need to modify, change, upgrade some of the classic benefits around cloud and cloud native. And microservices works well in that regard because it means that you can isolate specific parts of what you want to achieve and make those changes without impacting the other parts of the application. I think it's interesting to consider the vendors and the traditional vendor community, which has not always supplied its solutions and services in microservices-based applications. I think it's fair to say that for the last 2 to 3 years, operators have been trying to work with current and new vendors to get them to break down their applications into microservices to give them that flexibility and scalability. And in some cases, it's been harder to persuade a vendor that it's in its interest to do so. However, we do see a lot of progress in that regard. Many vendors now embracing microservices. I think one reason for that is that if you as a vendor have a new feature that you want to bring to market quickly, if you've supplied your capabilities in a microservices architecture, it's easier to position that new feature via a single microservice and to win acceptance and win customers for that. I think when it comes down to governance, a number of operators I speak to are still working through precisely where and how to deploy a governance approach. And when we look before at the different parts of the business where operators are using microservices, working out precisely when and how to deploy a governance program is I think something that operators are trying to work out at the moment. I think we talk a lot about microservices, but actually many operators are looking at building what is sometimes called components, and a component could contain a number of different microservices, and so it's really a question of where you put the external borders around your microservices or around your components. And some may decide, for example, that for certain applications they want to build the APIs around the components, and maybe they'll over time they'll want to refactor the microservice sitting with components. So I think we're seeing a number of different approaches being taken, and I think as the numbers from the survey showed, still in the fairly early of working through the best approaches towards governance. I'm now going to hand over to Karthik, who's going to specifically talk about governance and what Tori Harris calls the what, why, and how. So Karthik, over to you.